Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. My name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, the future of work consultancy that sponsors the Wise Decision Maker Show. And today with me is Abakar Saidov, who is the CEO of Beamery. Abakar, don't you tell us a little bit about what Beamery does?
Hi there, Gleb, and thank you so much for having me on the show. Absolutely. So Beamery is a talent lifecycle management platform that leverages machine learning to help enterprises understand the skills and capabilities of their workforce to attract, retain, and upskill their talent, reach their diversity goals, adapt to the future of work, and create business agility and resilience in a fast-changing world.
So let's talk about the future of work, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, in short, we're an AI-focused HR technology company that works with the world's largest enterprises to help them solve some of their biggest challenges.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Now, let's talk a little bit about the future of work component that you mentioned. So what are you finding are the biggest struggles that your clients are dealing with in terms of hybrid work right now?
Absolutely. So I think what's interesting about hybrid work is the context of the overall organizational change that businesses are going through today. So because hybrid is not happening in isolation, it's also happening in a very quick transition to upskilling and reskilling that a lot of businesses are facing. So when you combine those two forces, it gets really, really interesting because, for example, purely dealing with one dimension of, how do I get the most out of my people, but also how do I give the most to my people? Right? It's a two-directional relationship. But at the same time thinking the types of skills and capabilities that my business needs is changing. Like I'll give you an example. I was speaking to a manufacturing business recently, and they said to me, what they're currently looking at is historically they used to have R&D, engineering, and IT. Now those things are blending. Now they have, say, digital engineering or digital R&D. And they're also looking at where do they have those people? Where do those skill sets exist? Can they be in Asia? Can they be in Latin America? Can they be in the United States? What needs to be true to be able to reach those goals? And so when you think about the business objectives are tied to kind of effective talent execution, but at the same time, those business objectives need to incorporate the flexibility of how people work, where they are, and what they need to get out of it. And so what's really interesting for me is that word flexibility, which is flexibility is not about individual preferences. It's about being flexible to the right way to solve a specific problem. For example, in some places, that work needs to be in person. In some places, actually, to get the best people, it's actually the inverse. And so I think that coalescence of those kind of macro factors, business transformation, and hybrid become very, very fascinating.
I want to go back to something you said earlier in your comment about upskilling and reskilling. Now, I've helped 23 companies by now transition to hybrid work arrangements, return to office, remote work, all of that stuff. And I find that workers often don't realize that they need to develop a different skill set to work in a hybrid modality or remote modality than they did in an in-person modality. And that especially applies to managers. Managers tend to apply the same ways of managing in hybrid work and remote contexts that they apply to in-person context. What are you finding about the reskilling, the upskilling to enable managers to manage in that environment, to enable workers to work in that environment, and for leaders to even have the mindset shift to have that problem-solving orientation that you're talking about, the flexibility necessary to seriously compete in today's world?
That's a wonderful question. So I couldn't agree with you more that the manager, that mythical middle manager is actually the crux of the equation here, because it's actually completely incorrect to say, it's the employee's fault that this isn't working. We're actually unequipped, and historically, all of the training and all of the manager training has been unequipped to how to allow people to lead in a kind of hybrid or remote environment. And there's a few building blocks to that. And what's interesting is actually so much of work historically has been apprenticeship. Right? Like you learn on the job, you learn from your peers, you osmose information. When that apprenticeship becomes harder because, interactions on Zoom, you need to be deliberate about learning. And so you need to create frameworks around how to teach managers to actually ensure it happens. And, obviously with my technology hat on, this is kind of where technology can be incredibly powerful, right? Because the technology can highlight where managers can be missing stuff and also nudge managers towards kind of opportunities. So for example, knowing that for a particular set of people on your team may have actually varying degrees of competency in different skill sets and require different types of coaching. Right. And so suddenly you're creating visibility, which is kind of part one, knowing what exists on your organization. So for example, most companies, if you ask them kind of a simple question, or even if I asked you directly, what skills do you have? It's a really hard question to answer because you need context. Why are you asking? Are you asking me because of a mechanical engineering role? Or are you asking me because of a content writer role? I might be able to do both, but what I tell you is different. And then the second question is about kind of quality and consistency. The very best managers know how to do this, but that is trained over a very long period of time. So how do you make everyone good at this? And so I think that technology can be very powerful, and specifically the advances not only in kind of AI, but also some of the generative pieces that we've seen recently with things like what we've announced, Talent GPT, where you can actually really think about what questions are you not asking. So for example, imagine if you were able to come into work every day as a leader and say, what does my team need today? Right. And something is able to tell you, well, these team members are already interested in this particular advancement, and the career goal they have for 2 years from now is this. In order to get them there, they need coaching on this specific thing. This particular team member is potentially not as engaged as they could be, or they're particularly struggling. This is where they need help and coaching. And so suddenly it goes to the manager of, well, how do I do that? For example, is it through directly teaching? Is it through on the job experience? Or is it through connecting them with a mentor? Like, who can teach them these things? And so the ability to be able to have the kind of transparency of information flow with a decision assist and an action assist of what you can do.
So it's interesting that you mentioned your new launch of the Talent GPT and more broadly, generative AI. I've seen that already be used by some of my clients. And what we've seen is that it's especially helpful for the workers who are working remotely, whether full-time or part-time, rather than the in-person workers, because in-person workers, managers have a closer read on what's happening with them. But if you're using AI tools, you can have an easier read of people who are working remotely. So it seems that the age of AI, which we're seeing right now, will likely facilitate more people working remotely because it'll be easier to manage them, connect with them, know where they are, what skills they're learning, what they're developing. What are your thoughts on how AI will impact people's ability to not simply do their job remotely, but also build a career remotely, whether in their current company or in other companies?
So I think in a number of ways, I couldn't agree with you more that the benefits obviously exist in hybrid and remote environments in many ways, but I'll give you kind of one maybe thread to pull on. So in our own journey, and we see with a lot of our clients, in order to be effective at remote and hybrid, the first stepping stone is information sharing, because as you said, if people are in person a lot, information sharing happens organically. In remote or hybrid, there are more friction points. And so the starting point is, okay, so the quality of information, whether it's your company wiki and these pieces versus even kind of quality of learning and onboarding collateral. And so the first kind of dimension is, does that information exist? Because no matter how good the AI and language models are, they learn on something. And so what's interesting that we're seeing is a transition shift to the types of jobs that need to be done in the company. So for example, take something as simple as support. You can be a remote support person and interact with customers all day online. But with generative AI, a lot of the support questions that a customer needs can be actually answered with AI, as long as the thing that they're learning from is high quality content. And so the support job is changing from being a ticket triage person to being a content writer person to teach the AI models things. And what's interesting is that is in many ways, kind of what companies would describe as a higher skill role and a higher paid role. But also a high quality role. And so I think what's really powerful here, to your point, is not only is it going to, I think, make people more successful in their careers, but I actually think these jobs are more rewarding. And so I think the capacity of the transition here is to create meaningful work that is interesting and rewarding, because, if we admit it, not all work feels as rewarding as other work. And I think that the capacity here is actually to make something more interesting.
Now, so you're talking about the people not being the ticket processors, but content writers. And I can just hear some of my clients, the CEOs, they're saying, oh, that's great that we can have more content writers. But how do I calm the employees who feel that, well, you need 100 ticket writers, but you only need 10 content writers? How do I address those fears? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, what's interesting is actually a few dimensions to this. So one is the capacity. So maybe taking a few steps back. One of the common examples given of the quote unquote industrial revolution is that taking somebody from the field and putting them in the factory is an easier reskill than taking somebody from the factory and teaching them to be a graphic designer, right? And which is a true fact. However, graphic design is, especially with generative AI on the kind of visual side, is becoming a role that can be very vastly different tomorrow than it is today, which is it's about creating definitions and creating something that requires a lot less technical knowledge in how to do the graphical interface and much more creativity around kind of what you're trying to design. And so what I actually see, and there's an opportunity here, is that the bridging of the gap of transitioning from, to use maybe crass words, what would be considered as kind of entry-level roles or hourly roles to something that would actually be seen as a kind of a higher skill role. Actually, I think that bridge is much narrower with the enablement of AI because a lot of the complexity behind the technical task required is eliminated.
And so you're thinking that it will be easier to teach people, to upskill them, given in this model. So let's think about that upskilling a little more. So I asked you about the kind of upskilling. You talked about managers and the upskilling they need. What about the kind of upskilling that employees need, both in the relation to working effectively in their time when they're working remotely and in the kind of skills they need to work with generative AI?
It's a very good question because I think it's so broad, right? Like it very much depends on kind of industry, etc. But one of the kind of interesting trends that we're starting to see is a few components. So one is the way that organizations think about things like offshoring, nearshoring, kind of versus actually keeping things onshore, right? Like because a lot of the time, historically, the argument was, take things offshore to reduce cost, because we have highly talented, skilled people, but if things are lower level tasks. So a lot of the time, actually, maybe from a macro perspective, it enables organizations not to have to do some of the offshoring and nearshoring specifically. But more importantly, I think from an employee's perspective, there are two vectors. So the first is, well, for example, we do a lot is understanding not just current skill sets. So for example, our talent graph engine is able to do kind of skill inference to say, this is kind of based on a lot of factors we know about you, for example, where you work, what you've done in the past, education, etc. And the context of the role that you're in, we can infer with a high degree of accuracy of what the likely skills you have and capabilities you have to perform the role. However, that's only a starting point, because then you're starting to look at skill proximity. And so what's really powerful from an employee's perspective is actually career navigation and career opportunity. So I'll give you an example. We have a financial services client, very large bank that is thinking that especially with everything that's going on today with these advances, the job of an actuary is becoming, a lot more focused on data science. And so they are thinking of like, how do you start hiring and training data scientists to be actuaries rather than training actuaries to be data scientists? But a lot of the time, as somebody with that skill set, you wouldn't think to yourself, oh, I'm going to pursue a career as an actuary, because nobody told you could. Sure. And so from an employee experience perspective and from a manager perspective, it allows you to really broaden the aperture to understand what is possible in, for example, adjacent skills. How far away are those skills from each other? And what is the ability to retrain? And it solves a bunch of different things. One is it solves, from a kind of employee's perspective, the opportunity. So for example, I may not have considered a particular career because I thought it was this, but now these things are available. But from a manager's perspective, it allows you to think about the trade-offs. For example, would I rather spend a long time hiring somebody, or would I rather actually retrain somebody internally? And it might actually be cheaper and easier to do that, improve retention, etc. there's additional factors where if you start looking at people as the capabilities that they have today as well as tomorrow, like let's say today you can build a table, tomorrow you can make a computer, and after that you can make a spaceship. Obviously, I'm using a random example, but somebody doesn't think that by starting here, they're actually on this journey, but an employee can actually see that. And so being able to go there also opens up a lot of other avenues, such as, diversity recruiting, diversity retention, because you're suddenly looking at not the historical career tracks that have existed, but actually how to develop people over time.
And I want to circle back to the point that you made earlier in our conversation about problem solving and looking at the future. Well, how do you see employees in the future, looking at the next 3 to 5 years, thinking about changing their thinking about remote work and hybrid work, and also generative AI as a means of solving their problems and as a strategic tool in their toolkit? What are your thoughts about the future?
Well, future's bright, obviously, but I think that now is an amazing moment in time because I think employers, by and large, are recognizing that this is not optional, that things are not going to go back to normal. And, I loved reading some of your articles, and as you probably saw from some of our talent index findings, is that in a lot of organizations, there's this kind of vain hope that we can forget about all of this and things will go back to normal. We'll go back to kind of different types of productivity levels. But if you unpack it, I think this has been such a trigger to be able to say, why does work have to happen in the way it used to happen? Because there's the capability, if done right, if you enable managers correctly, if you use the technology correctly, we can be a lot more productive rather than less productive. So, there's amazing examples of software engineers using tools like Copilot, being 30 to 40% more productive than not. And, we also know that software engineers do a lot of their productive work kind of alone and undisturbed, which does not need to be necessarily in the office all the time. And so when you think about these productivity gains, we're suddenly looking at a kind of leap forward in terms of what organizations can achieve. And the main piece there would be going back to this word flexibility. Flexibility isn't pandering to one party or the other. Flexibility is being flexible as to what works best, right? And it's understanding what the people need to be most effective and what skill sets are needed in which regions and in which job architectures, etc., to actually produce the outcomes that you're looking for. And I think a lot of the time we revert to rigidity rather than flexibility.
Interesting. Yeah, so I think it's definitely very important to have the mindset shift to be more flexible, whether we're thinking about remote work, generative AI, what's going on in the future, thinking about how to solve those problems. Great. Are there any last words with which you wish to leave our audience?
Well, I appreciate you asking. I think the last words for me would be the amazing thing that we've started to see is the prioritization of all of these topics by business leaders, not just HR people leaders. And, CEOs have been saying for the last, 40 years that, talent's my number one priority. And at the same time, when you would ask, what are you doing about it? They would look at the HR function and hope that something happens. And what's really happened, I think, since the pandemic is that the spotlight has been that it's not optional to do this anymore. And if you want to really get engagement, you need to look at the kind of line of business outcomes. So, back to the points we were making earlier, if you're in manufacturing or if you're in construction or if you're in financial services, and you ask a chief revenue officer or a chief risk officer, and you say, what are your biggest objectives for the next 12, 24, 36 months? They'll tell you what they are. And you say, how do you do those things? How do you go and build stuff in India? And they're like, well, I need people, I need skills. And so everything comes back to something needs to change. And those things are the way that we work with people, up-level people, and enable people. And that conversation has accelerated so much. And that means that suddenly change is happening, technology is happening. Those leaders are in those conversations where they didn't used to be. And I think that's a really exciting thing.
Excellent. That's a great point to wrap up. Thank you very much. This was very helpful, Abakar.
No, most welcome.
And thank you to the audience for checking out another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. Please make sure to subscribe if you haven't yet, wherever you checked out the show, and leave a review. It really helps others discover the show and helps us improve the show. All right, everyone. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. In the meantime, the wisest and most profitable decisions to you, my friends.